All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Simon, and I'm the chair of GA for the 6th Committee Legal at ILMUNC India 2016. I'm super excited. I'm also really excited if you're with me listening. It's 9 a.m. here. So there's a bunch of stuff that I'd love to talk to you guys about. And that ranges from everything that's happening in the political spectrum here in America, which, if you guys have been following the news, you may have heard we elected a new president last night, which is actually crazy. The upset was really insane, and just the reactions here were crazy. But obviously, we're here to talk about Model UN. So, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to talk to me, ask me anything. I'm pretty competent in terms of GA procedure. I've been doing it for now 6 years, and legal especially is my favorite committee in all of the GAs. So you can ask me anything, whether it pertains to GA procedure, whether it pertains to what I'm looking for in a delegate, whether it pertains to what you can expect at ILMUNC India if it's your first time. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to go to our website at ilmuncindia.com/webinars. That should be where you guys are watching it. And you can post in the chat and just ask me any questions that you want. Otherwise, I'm just going to go with my own agenda, and then feel free to chime in at any point, and I'll be watching for you guys. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to talk about is legal this year at ILMUNC India. The two committees, the first one is going to be talking about the contemporary law of the sea, and the second one is the reformation of peacekeeping. And the one thing that I like about legal is the potential to talk about both topics, which isn't necessarily something that happens here in America. A lot of times when we talk about, or when we bring up GA committees in both high school and college conferences, they have the potential to only talk about one just because people are so adamant about talking about one particular topic, which is not necessarily problematic, but it can be a little detrimental to people who have talked about and really researched both topics. So one thing that I hope that we'll get to do during legal in India is to be able to talk about both reformation of peacekeeping and the contemporary law of the sea. So once you guys open the background guide, which you should be able to do, and again, if you can't, please email our SecGen or let me know in the chat right now, and I should be able to help you. But if you open the background guide, you'll see obviously the contemporary law of the sea and then the reformation of peacekeeping. And one thing that I love that ILMUNC India does is the dynamic background guides, which you should also definitely get a chance to look at. Just because they're really helpful in terms of ensuring that you know exactly what we're talking about come committee. Just because they're more recent things, and they'll really help you guys get a chance to really understand what we're trying to talk about when we're actually in committee. So then another thing that I wanted to mention is how I want to see the GA structure kind of play out. So generally what happens in a GA is you have a speakers list, which is just the most formal type of debate. That's how it typically opens once people all settle into committee, and then we'll have time to talk about which topic we want to discuss first. And that's really important once you come to ILMUNC India, ensuring that you know which topic you want to bring up first, because it is possible that we won't get to both. So you definitely want to take time to understand what you want from committee. And so the most important thing to do is just to understand that that's probably what you're going to be looking for when committee actually starts. Hang on one second. Okay, so sorry about that. But somebody just asked me for my email address, which I gave you guys my secondary email address in the comments. If you have any questions or need help with anything, I'm there for you. So going back to what I was talking about, so the speakers list is definitely going to be how I would like to see committee start out. It's definitely going to be one of the most important parts of committee because it's really going to lay the ground for everything that we're going to be talking about come Thursday through Sunday. So one thing that I want to look for when people actually bring up the speakers list for the first time is that they're not just pushing their own agendas necessarily, but they're really taking into account what everybody else in committee is talking about in reference to the specific topics. So let's say that you believe that like your country believes that reformation of peacekeeping is more important or more pertinent for whatever reason. You should really be taking into account whether everybody else believes that to be the case, because one of the most important things that I see coming from Model UN or committee sphere in general is like fostering an intense sense of collaboration, because one of the most problematic things during a GA especially is when delegates fail to collaborate. And so one thing I'm really going to be looking for over the course of the weekend is that people are trying to talk to each other, trying to figure out where discrepancies are coming up in certain working papers when it comes down to the actual substance, the content of the papers, where certain people are saying, oh, this makes sense or this doesn't, and then figuring out how to work with everybody in order to determine the best solution. Let's see. Okay, how do we start about? Okay, so I got a question. I got is how do we start about with our research apart from the background guide? And that's a great question. One thing that I mentioned a little while ago was the dynamic background guides, which are posted just at the bottom of every committee page if you go to our website. And they're actually a really cool thing that we don't get to do here in America. So when I learned that that was something that I got to do for you guys, I thought it was really helpful because it's a much more updated version of the background guide effectively. It will give you like a springboard for your research. It'll help you guys really understand what's going on in the current situation in order to be able to really determine whether certain parts of the background guide are most useful and how your country specifically should be addressing each topic. So beyond that, one thing that I really like to do when it comes to researching after you get your background guide is just to look up the topic and search specifically for PDFs on Google, because in general PDFs are going to be more academic than regular web pages if you were just look at it as like a broad proportion. So I really prefer to look at PDFs when I'm searching, just because I feel like they're a more effective way, and it's less because you spend less time looking through articles that you know are not going to be useful in your research because many of them are not academic. So when you're looking at PDFs or research papers, they're generally more academic than they would be otherwise. So that's one way that I like to start research. Another way, if you go to Wikipedia, which again I will not respect Wikipedia as a source, but I do respect the fact that it is an open source for information and knowledge. And so one thing that you can do is to go to Wikipedia and then figure out where they cited sources from. And again, those will not necessarily be legitimate in any way, but if you're stuck and you need somewhere to go, that could be a good starting point. Okay, great. So another thing that I wanted to bring up with you is the idea of an unmoderated caucus, which if you've done Model UN, you'd probably be pretty aware of, just because it is so chaotic and it is really important to Model UN as a whole. So if you don't know, and again, this is for anybody who has never done Model UN before, and if you haven't, I'm really excited to have you in committee. So an unmoderated caucus is basically just when all of the delegates have time to freely roam around the committee room and even outside of the committee room. in order to determine whether they believe that they have any allies or any foes effectively in the committee, and figure out what they need to do to advance their working paper and make sure that more people are aware of it. It has increased like awareness and knowledge throughout the committee. So one thing that you guys should really focus on when you're working in unmoderated caucuses is making sure that everyone is included. And my chair, my vice director and I we'll be walking around and we'll be talking about, we'll be just looking in basically to see how people are interacting during unmoderated caucuses, because that's a really important thing that we're going to be looking out for. Just because when it comes down to the spirit of competition, we know that everybody wants to do well, everyone wants to succeed, and in my opinion, the most important part of that is making sure that everyone's voice is heard. So during unmoderated caucuses, they're a great time to really figure out who your allies are, who you think that you can continue writing and working with. But at the same time, I don't want to see people being boxed out from blocks, even though that in a way that is inherent to the sense of the committee. That's something I definitely am trying to avoid, and I hope you guys can work on that with me. Just because I feel like it is extremely important to the layout and kind of how committee works as it progresses throughout the weekend. So another question I just got is when can we have an unmoderated caucus, which is also a great question. I think it depends really on how you guys want to work with committee, because one thing that I'm going to really try and do is remove myself from the committee and kind of let you guys run it the way you want it, and kind of just serve as an intermediary between parties and figure out at what point you want certain things. So unmoderated caucuses, for example, I'm only going to allow them at certain points, just because for the sake of debate, a lot of times they can be counterproductive, because I know as a delegate as well that unmoderated caucuses are extremely important, and they can be really useful. But one thing that they can disrupt is just the flow of debate, because if we're having like a moderated caucus, for example, we start with the speakers list, then we move into a moderated caucus perhaps, and then we go into an unmoderated caucus, and then we go back to unmod. It's just there's a lot of disruption. It gets really choppy. So I try and minimize the choppiness by not having too many, but at the same time, I know the actual time spent in unmoderated caucuses is really important. So I will probably allow them after we have a good substantive set of debates during the first moderated caucus, and we may shift into something else depending on where the committee is at that point. So in general, if I were to give you like an actual timeline, it would probably be like towards the end of Thursday session. I could see one possibly happening. If not, we'll definitely start on Friday for sure, because that's something that you guys are probably going to need. Okay, and then another question I just got: Wikipedia reliable or Reuters? That's a great question. Reuters is actually not. It's funny because Reuters isn't really a source that people bring up or use a lot here in America. When we talk about news sources, it's always like the classic American ones like CNN, CBS, Fox News, which is not ideal, but that's a totally separate topic. So like I said again, Wikipedia, if you have no idea what you're talking about, if I don't know about a committee, or if I don't know about a topic, and I really have like no idea where to start, that can be a good place. But you have to take basically everything on Wikipedia with a grain of salt, because the barriers to entry to being able to edit a Wikipedia article are really low. So it can be really problematic in that regard. So in general, I would trust Reuters personally, obviously much more than I would Wikipedia. But at the same time, there are plenty of sources out there that can be very viable. So that's something like I would just keep in mind, the fact that Wikipedia can be a little questionable. But I mean, Reuters, BBC is a great source. They're a bunch that can really help you in your quest for knowledge. Another question was, how would you determine an ideal best delegate? So that's a great question, and it's always on everyone's mind. It's certainly on my mind when I'm competing on the college circuit here in America. And so one of the main things, like I said earlier, that I look for is collaboration. So I don't want to see, one thing that I hate is when delegates are trying to steamroll through other delegates, considering that their ideas and opinions are not important. And so one thing that I really want to see you guys doing is ensuring that other people are really understanding what's going on, especially if there's like a newbie or like a new person to Model UN, that they don't feel like they're being boxed out or left out of anything because they don't really understand what's going on. Because I'm definitely looking forward to some fast-paced debate, and unmoderated caucuses are definitely going to be fast-paced as well. But what I don't want to see is people getting shut out of things because of that. So in a best delegate, obviously there's no formula or anything, but I really want to see people who are helping other people really understand and like enjoy the conference to its fullest. Because at the end of the day, that is what ILMUNC India is about: is enjoying it, like getting something from it, learning. And so I'm going to be looking for people who are keeping all of those things in mind when conference actually starts. Let's see, another question. Will a delegate miss out on awards because he didn't follow his foreign policy regarding the agendas? So this is basically a question about whether, let's say you're representing a specific country, and you are kind of deviating from the policies that that country would normally have. Will I take that into account when deciding awards? And the answer is yes. Because the main thing that I'm looking for, aside from collaboration, is ensuring that everyone is prepared. And if you were saying something like a policy agenda, if you're setting a policy agenda that's completely different from one that I could expect your country to have based off all of the literature that's available, then I'm going to be asking a question like, did that person do his or her research? Why are they deviating as much as they are? So it's definitely something that I'll look to. I'm not going to really harp on it if you are if your foreign policy is slightly different from what I'd expect it to be, because that's not going to be a huge problem. At the end of the day, I'll know that you probably may have used different sources than I did when looking into what certain countries view on certain issues. But just keep in mind, I want you guys to be well informed because it's going to make a much stronger conference when it actually comes time. Okay, let's see, another question. How frequently would a delegate be recognized over the course of 4 days? So that's definitely something important because, like I said, I want to make sure that everybody like really experiences ILMUNC India to its fullest, and that involves getting called on and getting to speak, because that is, in a way, in my opinion, one of the best parts of competing and really being on the Model UN circuit here in America. And so speaking is really important to me, so I'm going to make sure that everybody gets to speak, hopefully as frequently as they want to, even though I know supply will be pretty high in regards to speaking. So I can't give you like an actual like ballpark number even, but chances are you'll be able to speak like a time or two on Thursday, and then a ton on Friday and Saturday. Hopefully the size of legal is such that like it's big, which is awesome. It's one of my favorite parts of GAs. But it's not so big that you won't get the opportunity to speak if you want to, which will be good. Let's see. Look at Miss. Okay. Another question: will challenging be allowed in the committee? Yes, challenging to a certain extent in certain realms will be allowed, but at the same time, I know pretty well when you should challenge and when you shouldn't. So if people are just errantly going to others or raising their placards and saying point of order for whatever reason, or challenging other delegates or challenging me, I will accept that if it's relevant and if it's valid. But I don't want to see people just challenging because they want the attention, because they think it looks good. Because I will appreciate a valid challenge that I actually accept. But at the end of the day, if you're just raising your placard for attention, I'm not sure what the necessarily the reason is. But sometimes, especially here in America, people will just challenge like aggressively for no reason, it seems, and so there's a lot of confusion, and delegates and the chair are both kind of concerned. So I don't want to see that from any one delegate. But at the same time, challenges are an important part of speaking. So if you need to challenge and you feel like that's something that you should do, then by all means go for it. Just keep in mind that if it gets too aggressive, there may be consequences. Okay. Let's see. Normally. Okay, this is a good question. let's see. It's asked, normally chairpersons do not see delegates during unmods, and at ILMUNC, can we expect the chair to focus on every delegate during an unmod? So I mentioned unmods a little while ago, and I also mentioned that my vice director and I will likely be walking around kind of surveying the room during unmoderated caucuses. And so the answer is no, you can't expect every delegate to be seen during an unmod in the sense that there are only two of us. We may have a few staffers. I'm not 100% sure yet what the breakdown is going to be, but there may be a couple more people walking around with us, kind of just surveying what's going on in unmods, who's talking with whom about what. So in that sense, you can expect us to kind of be surveying the room, but it's not like we're going to be perusing each individual conversation and saying, okay, this is exactly what's happening here. This is who's talking to whom at what point. And this, I didn't like the way this one person was treated. It's going to wind up not being exactly like that, only because there are only two people, perhaps a few more. So I'm not sure exactly how that's going to play out in terms of unmoderated caucuses for you guys, just because there are a bunch of things that could happen, considering that there are only two of us. So one thing that I really want to make sure during unmods is that people kind of maintain decorum, even though it is just an unmoderated caucus, because they can get really hectic. Again, I've never been to a conference in India, so the dynamic might be a little bit different than what I'm used to, and I'm really excited and like happy to work with that. But just keep in mind that I will be making sure that nobody is really like getting shafted in any way, just because that can be problematic. So I'll be walking around. So I just want to see what's going on. But at the same time, if you see me walking around and you are if you see me walking around, don't necessarily change your behavior, because that's not at all what I'm looking for. I'm just looking for how debate is kind of going. I just want to see, I just want to active as a passive observer effectively. And so that's going to imply me just walking around and maintaining that I know what's going on, and maintaining that you guys know that I know, if that makes sense. And so let's see. Okay, another question I have is just asking whether a crisis will happen. And I actually am unsure of that, just because I don't have the schedule yet. So it is possible, but it's also not possible. I will obviously keep you guys updated, but hopefully, if there is one, you wouldn't know until it actually happens. But again, I'm unaware as to whether that happens. Historically, at legal here in the U.S., we don't have crises, just because a lot of the debate gets wrapped up by Saturday night, but we also have a slightly different schedule. So again, I will obviously let you guys know that, but I'm not sure at the current time. Okay, yeah, so another thing that I just want to talk about specifically is speaking, because just like being a backroom delegate, like talking during unmods, coordinating about working papers, is a huge part of Model UN. So is the actual speaking component of it, which is, like I said, one thing I really appreciate about Model UN and being on the circuit. So one thing that I'm really going to look for during speeches is just like awareness of the topic. So that's that. All that means is doing your research and knowing what's happening during committee. Because one thing that I don't necessarily like seeing is when one person goes up to speak and then another delegate will go up and say something that's completely unrelated to what that person had just spoken about, and it's completely unrelated to the topic as a whole, because that can be really problematic. And so one thing that I really want the committee as a whole to avoid is just sporadic, just random speeches that have nothing to do with each other. The interconnectedness is effectively zero. So one thing, if a topic is brought up during a moderated caucus, which by definition will happen, I want to see everyone talking about the topic. Even though you can get caught up with what everyone is saying, you can get caught up in ideas that you might have had from a speakers list or previous moderated caucus, or perhaps an unmod. It can sometimes be tempting to talk about things that are not related to the topic of the moderated caucus, but it's really important that you guys all try and do that, just because you never know when you'll have time to talk about that topic again. So it's imperative for you guys that you take the time to really discuss that topic in specific. And so let's say, for example, the topic's peacekeeping, and there's an unmoderated caucus, like 30-second or 1 minute speaking time, just talking about funding for peacekeeping and where specifically it's going to be coming from. If you then talk about like deployment of troops and the specifics for where troops are going to be going, I will potentially rule that dilatory if it becomes a problem continually throughout the conference, just because it's really important that if we're talking about a specific topic, you guys really stick to it, and that you guys really focus on it for that time, because we probably will only have a limited time to talk about it throughout the weekend. Okay, another question is, Chair, can we oppose the study guide? I'm guessing that means, can you guys like talk or like figure out what you need to talk about in the background guide and decide whether or not that is appropriate for your committee? So I'm going to try and answer this question. If I don't answer it well, please feel free to let me know. But basically, if you see the background guide and really read through it, then I think you guys will get a good understanding of what the topics are each about. And there isn't that much to oppose in them, because they try to be an objective understanding, like a baseline understanding of each topic. So it will be kind of hard to oppose them in that sense. But then when it comes to actually doing research for your own countries, it's really important that you understand where your countries are coming from and how you can best represent their interests. So in that regard, you cannot oppose your own country's standpoint, because that would be directly counterintuitive to the whole point of Model UN. But I would, if there were a point when you were reading the background guide and you say, hey, like, I don't necessarily agree with that, that's great, and I would love to hear about it. But for the most part, you should be sticking to the background guide. You should be sticking to your country's stances, because I spent a lot of time prepping the background guide, like a lot of effort from a lot of different people in terms of formatting that went into it. And so the sources are all pretty accurate, pretty legitimate. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. That would be cool. But otherwise, you should be good with the background guide. Okay, let's see. Okay, so this is a good question. It basically just says, being legal, the sixth committee legal, what would be our mandate? And so basically, like, what power, what abilities do individual delegates have when it comes to writing resolutions? So like with all other GA committees, in like real life at the United Nations, the sixth committee will draft things to be passed by the overall General Assembly. And so one thing that I'm looking for is not necessarily like hard and fast, this is what's going to happen if our resolution happens, because at the end of the day, that isn't how the United Nations operates. So one thing, each individual doesn't have more power than his or her voice, if that makes sense. So you will have the ability to speak with other people, you have the ability to formulate ideas and eventually tabulate them into one resolution, which is my goal, maybe even pass a few, we'll see. So the resolutions themselves have the ability to call on other bodies to act in certain ways. For example, you can call on a group of countries to add a certain amount of funding to a specific project, for example. But in general, legal is pretty similar to other GA and ECOSOC committees in that it has the ability to suggest policy and suggest certain things for countries and for the United Nations as a whole. But at the end of the day, you can't have a resolution passed that says, if this gets passed, then these things will absolutely happen because legal has legislative power, because it absolutely doesn't. But that's okay. We'll obviously look at those resolutions, and there'll be a lot of editing and figuring out what in resolutions is working and what isn't over the course of the weekend. So don't be afraid if you think that something in your resolution doesn't make sense, because I'd love to talk about it, and we can probably figure out what you think is going on, and then what we think would be an appropriate course of action for your block. Let's see. Out. Okay, there's another question just about adding clauses to resolutions. And so the question is basically is adding a clause illogical just because it'll get vetoed by the P5s. And so that is not illogical. And adding clauses is actually really encouraged if you think that your working paper needs to be amended over the course of the weekend. Just because when you add clauses, it shows me that you understand that the committee is kind of dynamic, and what may have made sense a couple days ago no longer makes sense. So one thing that I could be looking for potentially is making sure that you guys are up to date and aware of the everything that's happening in committee, and that could entail potentially adding amendments. And the P5s are irrelevant in this case, just because in legal everyone has a single vote. So just making sure that you know that if you're going to pass, if you want an amendment to be added, that you understand the reasoning behind it. Just because I don't want to see errant amendments being added for no reason. And while I'm on the topic of amendments, they are an important part of committee towards the end of it. So one thing that I want to make the distinction between is friendly and unfriendly amendments, which you will likely know if you've done Model UN before. But friendly amendments are basically when the sponsors of a paper decide, hey, we think this clause should be added to our paper for XYZ, whatever the reason be, and it just gets thrown into the paper. Whereas an unfriendly amendment is suggested by someone who isn't a sponsor and is not agreed upon by all of the sponsors of the paper. And so unfriendly amendments historically take like quite a bit of time towards the end of committee, just because we're trying to figure out exactly what unfriendly amendments should go in a particular resolution and what shouldn't. So unfriendly amendments are something that I really want to see come out of committee, because a lot of times you can see a resolution and agree with a lot of it, but think that one section is just completely inappropriate and would not be feasible in the real world. So one thing that I want to see is just making sure that people are aware of that and people know that unfriendly amendments can be useful, but you have to take into account that the sponsors obviously will not appreciate it, which what in it nature makes it unfriendly. Yeah, let's see. Okay. Another question, just could we start a separate group of legal? Definitely start a group for legal. I know committees in the past a lot of times have had Facebook groups. I don't know how ubiquitous Facebook is, but I know obviously people use it all the time. Extremely popular. So Facebook groups can be really popular. If you guys want to make one before conference to get to know each other, that could be really cool. I don't know how you would go about finding out other people to add to it, but obviously after Thursday you could add it, and I could also potentially make an announcement if it's actually something that exists, so people could all go hang out there and like kind of get to know each other a little better. Um, Okay, another question is for bills, which we in America actually call them working papers and resolutions. And just for the record, a working paper is when you're in the process of writing one, and then a draft resolution is once they get cut down basically and synthesized into just a few papers that are really cohesive and have the correct structure. And then a resolution is something that actually gets passed. And so we as a body are saying, okay, legal wants this particular resolution to be sent to the greater United Nations for further consideration, because we think that it is something that could actually happen and like work out in real life. And so this question that I'm reading right now is just about whether they're signatories and ratifiers along with sponsors of a paper. So the answer is yes. They're sponsors and signatories. And a huge distinction that I want to make. So honestly, if you get just a few things from this video, I hope that this one is one of them. Signatories, the definition, just means someone who wants to see the resolution brought to the debate floor. So it's not necessarily, I agree with this paper, I want it to pass. That's in part the sponsor's job. A signatory just wants to see the resolution or the draft resolution or the working paper be brought to committee. So you can say, hey, I don't necessarily agree with all these ideas, but I think that your plan for budgetary spending is really interesting, and I want to see it be brought up in front of the committee as a whole. Then you'd sign on as a signatory. It's not necessarily, yeah, I dislike some of your ideas, therefore I'm not going to be a signatory. That's not at all how it works. And so then the distinction there between signatories and sponsors, signatories, again, just someone who wants to see the issues debated, and sponsor is someone who's had a hand in writing the paper. So a sponsor is someone who's had their actual ideas interwoven into the paper. You don't necessarily have to have had legal, like legitimately like written or typed out the paper, but rather just have your ideas incorporated into the background guide, been part of the working paper, been part of the paper since almost its inception, just because it is really important to see that you guys understand where you're coming from. And so if you just if you just decide to become a sponsor somehow on a working paper on Saturday, let's say, after we've had a ton of debate, and you don't really know what the working paper is about, then I'm going to be kind of confused as to why you became a sponsor on that paper. So just keep in mind, I want to see people being sponsors from the start of committee, because that is really important, because otherwise you'll get to a point where you're a sponsor on a working paper and you don't really know why, which can be problematic. Another question, can we draft commissions and conventions instead of resolutions in a committee? And I haven't heard that ever happening, so the answer for the time being is no, unless I hear otherwise. If you want to specify like commissions and conventions, because we actually don't really use those in committee here in America, it's strictly resolutions, so it's likely going to be kept that way. But again, I'm open to potentially changing the dynamic of committee depending on what you guys want from it. But keep in mind, I'll be pretty stern if things aren't making sense, because what's most important is flow of debate is maintained. Another question, will you be interested in 2 blocks? So I'll be interested in as many blocks as are appropriate for committee. That could be 2, but at the start it absolutely will not be, because there are going to be a bunch of different factions. There are going to be a bunch of blocks, be it geographic, be it political, economic, whatever it is. There will be a lot of ways that the dynamic in committee can shift. Which is really cool. So when the first unmoderated caucus happens, and when you guys are all starting to meet each other for the first time, and really like talking about speakers list, or bringing it up and actually speaking during the speakers list, we're going to see a lot of things happening. And one thing that I want everyone to be looking for is what the substance of speeches is during those speeches. Just because during the speakers list, that's basically everyone's chance to really talk for the first time, and people will be outlining their most important arguments and their main ideas. So if you hear someone talking and you say, oh, hey, I actually really agree with their policy standpoints, you're going to want to talk to them during unmoderated caucuses. You're going to want to mention them necessarily, or not necessarily, but perhaps during mods, just because it can be really helpful for you to form that alliance. So one thing that I want to see happening is just that during moderated caucuses, during speakers list, everyone is actively engaged in what everyone else is saying. Because at the end of the day, it can be difficult to not get caught up in your own drama or what's happening with your specific working paper, and you aren't really paying attention to what everybody else is saying. But at the same time, everybody who is talking during moderated caucuses and during speakers list has something important to say, otherwise they would not have raised their placards. So while it can get a little repetitive sometimes, and I'll be aware of that, I want everyone to really be listening to what people are saying during those times, because it is really important from a substantive policy standpoint. So you should really be looking out for that. And keep in mind that my chair and my AD, sorry, in America we always call them chairs and moderators, so the jargon is a little different. But my AD and I will definitely be listening just to what everyone is saying, because like I said, speeches are really important to me. I think they're a really important part of Model UN, and if I see somebody just go up and ramble kind of incoherently just because they wanted a chance to speak and they don't really know what to say because they haven't done the research, that's going to reflect negatively on that person. It's one thing to be like a little nervous about public speaking, totally get it, and that's not a problem, but it's another thing to try and monopolize speaking time just because you think that's the right thing to do, but not because you have a certain policy standpoint that you're trying to debate and get other people to understand why you're coming from that perspective. So I think that's it. That's all I had to touch on effectively from my end. If you guys have any questions, let me know. I'll stay live just for a couple minutes, and then I will sign off. But like I said, my email is above. Let me see. Yeah, my email's above. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know. And also feel free to let our SecGen know, Anna Rancic. She's awesome, really cool, and she has done an awesome job organizing this whole thing. So substantively and logistically, it should be really cool. So I'm really excited. Let's see, can you? Another question is about UPenn panels and ROP training. I'm not exactly sure what the reference is to there, but if you want to explain in more specifics, that would be cool. Um, okay, another question. If we're unable to finish our point during a moderated caucus, should we send a note, basically? I'm guessing that's what the last part of that sentence was about, to the chairs to be like, hey, this is the end part of our point. Here's an explanation for it. I don't think that'll be necessary because my hope is that everyone will get enough time to speak that that won't be an issue. So one thing that I want to see during moderated caucuses is you guys making sure that you understand the time constraints and that you try and get your main points in during moderated caucuses, because especially if they're like 30 or 45-second speaking time, they're going to be really fast paced, which if you've done Model UN before, you probably know that. So it can be kind of hectic. And so if someone tries to speak and doesn't get their whole point across, and then tries to send me a note, I don't think we'll have time to read it just because I'll be trying to pay attention to what everyone else is talking about when they actually go up to speak as well. So that's really helpful. Just making sure that you try and like be aware of your points and try and get them all out within the necessary time. But my hope is that everyone will have more than enough chances to speak, that won't be an issue. So let's see. There's one other thing I was going to say. Let me think about it. Can you read? Oh yeah, I can repost my email. And some people are saying the format for that is weird. Let me know if that's a problem. And then, oh, the last thing I wanted to make, which is just like more of a logistical point, is that you don't yield your time during a moderated caucus. That is important during a speakers list. Let's say, for example, you have a minute and you only use 40 seconds of it, then you yield your time to the chair in most cases. But in a moderated caucus, yielding doesn't happen. So just keep in mind that during conference, if you're doing a moderated caucus and you yield your time to the chair, which happens all the time in the United States, which is just it's just like a little error that isn't a huge deal, but I'll definitely mention it if it happens too many times during conference. Oh yeah, another question. While writing position paper, should we write about both topics? Yeah, there should be a bit. There should be like a cohesive argument as to why your country believes a certain thing for both topics. I don't know the exact specifics of the timeline of background guide writing for ILMUNC India, but if you have any questions, obviously let Anna Rancic know that. But it should be fine if you guys just write a bit on each. That shouldn't be a problem. Yeah. And so another thing, somebody just asked what my personal views on the new president of America, and it's really just I don't like. Obviously, I'll like probably keep my personal views aside just for the time being, but it is what everyone was expecting to be a statistical anomaly, just because people were not expecting him to win in any capacity, and so it was a huge upset. People are shocked here in America. There's definitely some emotional. There's like a huge emotional component to it. But basically, there's a huge group of invisible voters that a lot of statistical analysis websites didn't really take into account while the actual election was happening and leading up to it. So that was problematic, and just in the fact that people were not expecting people in America as a whole to vote the way they did. So it is kind of crazy, but that's all right. We'll see what happens over the next few years. Something interesting. We have two parties, Republicans and Democrats, and Republicans now hold two of the three major branches of government here. The legislative branch, which is comprised of the Congress and the Senate, both are really red, which is Republican, and then Donald Trump is also a Republican. So that's a lot of power in the Republican Party. It's a huge shift from Barack Obama, who's a Democrat. So it's really interesting here in America. We'll see how it plays out. But obviously that that is going to happen over the course of the next 4 years come January. So it's kind of crazy. And it also says my email isn't being posted for some reason. I don't know why that's the case. I'll try and figure it out and get back to everyone with my email address so you guys can ask me questions before conference actually happens. Okay, so I think that's all the time I have. But again, I'll try and figure out the email thing. And if you have any questions, continue to post them in the chat, and I will figure out why that's not working and get back to you all. But thanks to everyone who watched. Again, my name's Matt. I'm the chair of legal, and I'm really excited to meet you all in just a few days. It's crazy that it's almost going to happen. But this has been awesome. Thanks again, and I'll see you all soon.